for me, it's about thinking differently. So it's not about necessarily being an artist or being a dancer or a composer. And while all of those are creative activities, I also think that creativity is anything that we do that is above and beyond something that we are comfortable with. So it's about stepping out of our comfort zone, challenging ourselves to think differently and to solve problems in new ways, and coming up with new ideas, whether they be a grand scale or even if they are off a small scale. I think there are different denominations of creativity, and that anything that is a step away from our established mental structures is in a form creativity. Creativity in its multitudinous forms can be whatever we want it to be. So I don't think there's only one way of defining it. So you've asked me what my stance is and what my positioning is, which is different to yours. So I come at it from the psychology perspective. So I take the psychological view. My PhD research was in fact very much about how people develop expertise in creative thinking and problem solving skills. So it was in fact looking at how people's cognitive architecture evolves as they develop expertise in creative problem solving, and how they're able to use tools more effectively and approach the problem space differently. So for the short answer to that question is that I take the psychological view from the cognitive perspective. My PhD supervisor, Professor John Stevenson, was, I say was because he has since passed away, he was a cognitive psychologist, and I would say that it was his position that influenced me most. So he very much looked at how people develop expertise in different domains, and he supervised a number of people looking at different kinds of expertise. So some might have been around solving problems that were to do with architecture, others with design, and he took me on to look at how to solve problems from a creative perspective. Now, the reason I say that he influenced me so much is because my study turned into a longitudinal project. So I was able to actually map people's development of their creative thinking skills over a number of years. So I could see how people developed from being novice problem solvers into expert problem solvers over a period of several years. And that was very much a perspective that I drew from his work, where he looked at the way cognitive architecture and structures changed within people's schemas as they developed their expertise in different arenas. So, I mean, that's not to say that I haven't drawn on other people's work, such as Teresa Amabile, for example. I used many of her models to inform the model that I eventually developed, and also Goal and Fink, Ward and Smith, their work in how people change their or use different tools as they become more expert in their problem solving. So that's not to say that I didn't draw on all of those, shall we say, giants of creative research, but Professor Stevenson's work was probably my greatest influencer. If we were to look at the different skill levels that people bring to their capacity to solve problems creatively, for example, if we compare what a novice creative problem solver might do versus an expert creative problem solver, experts are able to very easily use tools and manipulate larger chunks of information, being able to synthesize concepts easily. What one might say that the novice does is that they don't take a strategic enough perspective to the problem, whereas experts take a much more strategic perspective to the problem that they're solving. So let me just explain what I mean by that. So if you gave, say, as I did with undergraduate students who were studying design, gave them a problem to solve, the first thing that they would do as novices, because they were still learning the craft of design, would be to start solving the problem immediately. So they would jump in, they would begin brainstorming, they would do all the things that you often think that go with creative problem solving, which is to just start doing it and start brainstorming. The experts, however, on the other hand, before they even began to think about how to solve the problem creatively, they did a number of different things in their approach, which were things such as to define the problem space. So they identified what were the resources that they would need in order to solve this problem? What were the time frames? Did they have specific milestones that they needed to meet for the client? And what was their budget? All of the things that they needed to know. And then once they had very strategically identified the problem space that they were working in, only then would they begin to brainstorm and start searching their internal cognitive database for ideas to inform the solution. And so the difference is that experts use much more strategic thinking throughout the creative problem solving process. So in answer to your question about what differentiates them and how can you identify someone who's highly creative versus someone who's not so creative, I would say that people who've learned to be expert creative problem solvers have learned how to use a very strategic approach to the problem solution.
And maybe like that could be related also to the level of education, because as you know, when you were doing your PhD, you had to think in a very different way to when you were doing your master's degree or your undergraduate degree. So it's also to do with the level of education that the person is at, isn't it?
I wouldn't say that necessarily. Certainly we think differently at different levels of education, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that, you know, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be able to be creative. In fact, there's actually some good research that in fact shows that the more expert you are, the less likely you are to be creative, interestingly enough. And that's because when we're highly educated and extremely expert in a particular field, we develop cognitive structures that help us to solve problems in that field. They're called schemas from the psychology perspective. And then once schemas become highly ritualized and, shall we say, for want of a better word, hardened in terms of our cognitive structures, that's what comes with expertise, it becomes harder to break them and to say, well, I'm not going to use that expertise that I've acquired all of these years and that I know how to solve a problem in a particular way. I'm going to do it differently. That actually takes an additional step. But that's not necessarily tied up with one's level of education, from my perspective.
Understand. And that leads me to the question about when we talk about problem solving, in a way, each one of us, without any education whatsoever, needs to solve problems. When we're born, we need to solve the problem of like, who's going to feed us? And, you know, we have strategies to get fed. We have strategies to develop in different ways and solve problems in our homes. So when we're talking about problem solving, the question is, well, what kind of problems? You know, it depends on the domain that we're contextually in. We can't be problem solvers in every domain.
Yes, yes, that's a good point. That's a good point. It's the old thing of the more we know, the more we can do with it. So if we're asking someone to solve a problem that is an engineering problem or an architectural problem or a design problem, the people who are most likely to be able to do that effectively are people who have very deep subject matter knowledge within that area. So they would be the sorts of when they solve problems, people who have deep expertise in a particular area, then they're more likely to come up with, the paradigm shifting kinds of solutions. But of course, they have to be the people who are the rules who will come up with a better outcome. That's one perspective. And then the other perspective is that even if someone doesn't have particular skills in a particular domain that are very deep and developed over many years, they can still express their own creativity within that domain. Like, for example, someone who may not have studied painting for years won't be a Picasso, but they'll still be able to come up with an interesting creation that for them is creative because they haven't done it before. It's breaking new territory for them. So for them it's creative, and we'll call that small c creativity, versus someone who has spent their whole life dedicated to a particular discipline, and they then break new boundaries. They are the ones who take us into uncharted territory and shift the industry and the paradigm in which they're working.
Yes, and I understand. So there's different levels of creativity, and I suppose that the societal, the contextual, the systems thinking view of creativity acknowledges that creativity can occur at the personal level and at the societal level, and it's very different.
Creativity has become one of the top most in-demand workplace skills. I think the World Economic Forum has put it at number 3 on the list of top 10 required workplace skills for 2020. Many of the institutions that deal in looking at jobs for the future have come out with the research that shows that creativity is at the top. So it's in a nutshell, it's because our world is moving so fast and there is a much higher degree of complexity, and as we were talking before, there is so much information coming at us from so many different channels that we need to be cognitively agile. We need to be agile learners, we need to be agile thinkers, and that is very closely related to being creative, because creativity is about not holding on to established ways of doing things, being prepared to look at things with new eyes, being prepared to synthesize ideas in order to come up with new outcomes, being prepared to use a series of tools so that we can solve problems differently that keep us out of that business as usual mindset. So the reason it is so important today is that it's become a workplace imperative, and the reason is because we need to be cognitively agile in order to solve problems quickly, efficiently, in different ways. That is what will keep organizations and businesses in any industry relevant and ahead of the curve, so to speak. And it's the people who are being creative and bringing their creativity in the organizations in which they work, who are helping those organizations to be future ready and vibrant and robust, so that they won't be disrupted and be caught unawares, but nonetheless have their own stores of new ways of doing things internally. So it's really important now more than ever for that reason, because the world is demanding it of us today more so than ever before.
It's a question of survival in many cases, isn't it, for businesses at least?
It's interesting that you say that, because in the past, creativity was always seen as a nice to have, that it didn't belong in the boardroom, that it was something that people did as an aside, whereas today there's this global recognition that creativity is, as you've just said, essential for survival in the complex world in which we live, that's being disrupted at every turn. indeed survival is a good way of putting it.